Hi, this is Ryan from Sili-Seedlings, and in this video I want to cover some of the basics about seed starting for your garden. Now you might think seed starting is straightforward. You just put some seeds in some soil and then you wait and then they grow into plants and that's it. And for the most part you're correct, but there are numerous ways and there are numerous pitfalls that can happen along those lines. So in this video I want to cover some of the basics such as how to actually plant your seeds in the soil, how to navigate the different kinds of soil to use, and there are many at your local big box store or garden center and which ones to pick, how to cull your seeds and why culling is important, some watering tips and how not to overwater most importantly, and also how to transplant your seeds and prepare them for your garden bed or wherever you're going to uppot them to. So I hope this video is helpful for both beginners and intermediate gardeners, and without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so let's go over some basics of seed starting. You'll need a few items here, the first of which obviously are seeds. These happen to be kale seeds, and I'm in Florida and right now it's October, so it's a little bit late to be planting these, but this is what I'm going to be using today. So you need seeds, a seed tray. Now this is, you could say, not necessary. It's perfectly fine to germinate and sow your seeds directly in the ground, but there are a number of benefits to using a seed tray, and I'll go over those in a minute. But if you're going to use a seed tray, make sure the cells are nice and big and it has drain holes in the bottom. This happens to be a silicone seed tray, which I prefer. So the third item you're going to need is soil. Okay, and let's go over some basics of soil. So there are many kinds of soil you can buy at any big box store. They come in giant bags, some come in smaller bags. The prices range significantly, and there are many types of soil that you could purchase. Raised bed soil, topsoil, seed starting soil, potting soil, and some other names that are somewhere in between those. In my experience and knowledge, there is no significant difference from all these, or at least there's no established criteria for which each of those names means. So one company might call potting soil one thing, and another company might use the name potting soil, but they really look much different. So regardless of the name that you're using, there's a few things you want to be aware of when seed starting in terms of soil. So you can see here, this soil is a little bit moist, and there is not a lot of big debris in it. If you're starting seeds with soil, you want to be careful not to, or at least try to pull out some of the big debris that comes in almost all big bag soil mixes. So stuff like this, you're going to want to pull out. And if I just kind of rub my fingers through this, I can get, there's like little rocks in here, and what you want to do is you want to just pull out as much of this as possible. So stuff like a big twig like this is like a piece of bark, I think. You definitely want to get rid of this. And the reason is because when you're starting seeds, if this happens to go over your seed, let's just say this piece right here, it goes over your seed, it might impact the seedling's ability to reach the surface because it has this heavy object over the top. And likewise, if this is under the seed, and the seed begins to germinate and the roots try to go down, they might be blocked by something like this, or any of these for that matter. So you want to do your best to get rid of these. Now it's not going to be possible to get rid of all of them 100%, but as long as you do your best to get rid of them, it should be fine and no problem. The other thing I'll say about soil is that they do make, as I said before or mentioned, seed starting soil. And that is basically debris free. There's none of this stuff in there. It's very fluffy and it's great for starting seeds. The downside is that it's much, much more expensive and you can't use it for other purposes. So personally, I like to use potting soil and just sort of filter out some of the big debris as much as possible. Now I'm just looking at this right now and this looks perfectly fine. There's some minor twigs in here, but that's not going to cause you any problems. Okay, so let's go back to the seed tray. And then we'll demonstrate, or I'll demonstrate, how to actually germinate seeds. Now, you can germinate seeds directly in the ground, or sow them directly in the ground if you have a raised bed, or you can use a seed tray. There's a few benefits to using the seed tray, which I'll be demonstrating today. The biggest benefit, I'd say, is that when you're sowing directly in the ground, let's just say this is the garden bed, and you're putting some of these seeds in the ground and then you cover them up with some soil. Environmental variables can affect or alter the seeds. So let's just say, for example, it rains really heavily after you plant your seeds. Well, that's going to probably scatter the seeds around and not in the desired places that you wanted the seeds to germinate. If you have, extreme weather, such as really hot or cold temperatures, that could affect the seed's ability to germinate quickly. And in addition to other environmental variables, such as birds eating your seeds or rodents coming by and eating the seedlings and whatnot. So just to be clear, it's perfectly fine to lay seeds right in the ground. I mean, people have been doing that for millennia. But if you want to use a seed tray, you avoid all of those variables and you can control how the seeds grow much better. So with a seed tray like this, what I can do is I can fill this up with soil, and then depending on all those variables, I can take it indoors, I can take it outdoors. If there's only sun, in certain areas of my backyard at certain times of the day, I can move this around. It's not stuck in one spot. If it's really cold at night and my seeds are just beginning to germinate, I might bring them inside so they don't get too cold overnight. And likewise, if it's just too hot outside and the leaves haven't grown yet, I might bring these indoors where there's some air conditioning. So, and obviously, well, hopefully, rodents won't be touching these if you are placing them in sort of protected areas, say in your garage or on a windowsill or whatever it is. So using a seed tray is very convenient. It will yield better results, and it can sort of protect your seed starting investment, I guess you could say, a little bit better. Okay, so let's get started and let's do the fun part. So I'm going to fill these up with some soil. I have here 6 cells. I can tell right now I'm going to need a little bit more soil. Okay. So what I did, I just filled up the seed tray with some soil. And this soil just came right out of the bag that I bought it in. It's relatively dry. There's not a lot of moisture in this. So what I'm going to want to do before I put the seeds in is get this nice and wet. But even before I do that, I'm going to try to pile on this soil as much as possible. So here's one of those big twigs. You don't want to be stingy with how much soil you put in your seed tray, because what's going to happen here is you'll see once I get this wet, and over time, when these things actually start to grow, the soil will begin to compress and push down. And if you don't put enough soil in, you'll be left with like a pretty big, empty rim around the top. And that, it's just, your roots won't go as deep if you are a little bit stingy with the soil. So just fill these up all the way to the top. Even like a heaping mound would be totally fine. Okay, so I have this nice and packed in here. Well, I say gently packed. Now I'm going to throw some water on the top and get this nice and wet, and then we'll sow the seeds. I'm not sure if you can see this, but there's some water draining on the bottom here. So now I know that the water's gone all the way through, and it feels relatively heavy, which means it's nice and wet. So next thing here is we're going to put some divots in this seed tray. So right in the middle here, I'm just going to put some really small divots with my finger. And you can use a pencil, but really, guys, you don't want to go too deep on this. And I find when I use a pencil, it goes a little bit deeper than I wanted. Because as you see here, these seeds are very, very small. And you just want them basically covered and to be completely dark. You don't want to bury these, too deep in the soil, because It needs to be able to penetrate the top as soon as it begins to germinate. Okay, we have our divots in each cell. I have 6 cells here, and there's 6 divots. Next thing I want to do is actually put the seeds in here. Now, how many seeds do I put in per divot? Well, that's a great question. It depends on how much insurance you want or how likely you think these seeds will germinate. So this is a brand new packet of seeds, and I have used these seeds in the past week, and I've gotten roughly about 90% germination rate on these, maybe even a bit higher. So I'm going to go just 2 or 3 per. So I'm just going to drop 3 of these. That's usually my go-to number with seeds that have high germination rates. If you have seeds that are older, let's just say they're from last season, or you've used them before and you haven't had the greatest luck with them germinating, then use more. You maybe use 4 or 5. But I'm pretty sure all of these are going to germinate, and I could probably do 2 per divot and it'd be just fine. But I'm going to eventually, 3 are going to grow in each one potentially, and I'm going to reduce the seeds to just 1, and I'm going to cut them later. So I'm overplanting and overseeding right now, and then later I will reduce them just to 1 plant. Okay, so I have roughly 3 seeds in every divot, and I'm going to now just cover it gently. And again, you just want to make sure that these are covered. You don't want to like pack a bunch of dirt over it. I'm just basically taking the dirt around that divot and just covering the seeds. Another method of doing this is taking some soil and just sprinkling it on top. Like for example, I'll just sort of sprinkle some, this one has a twig in it. I'll sprinkle some dirt on top, but this method I don't love because you end up putting more soil over the top than the method where you just sort of cover it. Either's fine. Just if you do the second method of, like I just did on this one, where you put more soil on top, make sure you're very, very gentle with how much soil you put on top. Okay, so these are all now covered and the soil is moist, and this is ready just to basically germinate. One last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a little bit more water just where I put the seeds to make sure those seeds are nice and moist and ready to germinate. So this is where you want to be very, very gentle. If you have a spray can that has like a spritzer function, not like a direct stream, but just like a spray, that would be perfect. I'm using a sort of a hose here, and I'm just going to be really gentle and just sort of give it just a little bit of just a very light drizzle over the top. And that's it. So this is going to now start germinating. In my experience with these actual seeds, it takes about 2 days for them to pop through the surface. And in the meantime, you want to make sure these are in a warm place. As soon as the seedlings begin to sprout, you'll want to put them in some light. But for now, keep them in a place where it's nice and warm. You know, maybe room temperature, around 80 degrees would be fantastic. And any colder will just take them longer to germinate, and any warmer probably is too hot. So try to keep these in a really delicate, temperate environment. And let's come back in a couple days and I'll show you what these look like. Okay, so it's been a couple of days here. You can see the seedlings just starting to pop through. This one, I don't see any seedling popping through yet. So I'll keep an eye on that one, and if it doesn't get a seedling within a day or two, I'll probably put a couple more seeds. But all of these have at least 2. These 3 all have 3. So as soon as you start to see here, as you do, the seeds starting to sprout through the seedlings, you want to start to put this in some light, in a place that has lots of light. Okay, so let's take a look at this in 1 more week. Okay, so this is about 1.5 weeks of growth. Again, this is kale, and things are looking great. I have multiple seedlings per cell. They're nice and green. I was careful not to overwater these. The tray definitely has some moisture in it, but it's not completely heavy and saturated with water. And these have gotten about 18 hours of sunlight per day, with the last day actually outside. So I'm going to start transplanting these pretty soon, but I'll probably let them get a little bit bigger. But I want to get them used to the sun a little bit before I actually plant these in the ground. Okay, now the bad news. So far, we've had a lot of fun, planting seeds, growing them, and watching these little guys, almost like magically, grow from a tiny little seed to this. But the problem is we can't have this many plants in one cell to grow up to be big plants. In other words, I need to reduce each cell, and there's 6 of them, to only 1 plant. And this is the sad part, because you actually have to start culling, or in this case, killing off the weaker seedlings. And you can use your own prejudice on which ones you want to keep or not keep. My rule of thumb is to keep the larger ones and then basically kill off the small ones. So you want to keep the strongest ones. I don't recommend keeping the runt of the litter here, even if you feel bad for it. You're better off using the biggest one with the biggest leaves. Okay, time to cull. Let's dive in. Okay, so the seedlings have grown a lot since we've looked at them last, and you can see the leaves are nice and green, and the stems are nice and thick and strong, and these are ready to be transplanted. As I said before, these are actually even a little bit too big. I wish I would have transplanted these a little bit earlier, but I just didn't get around to it. And just for the record, this was a combination of indoor and outdoor. And I probably should have kept them indoor because I was expecting to get more sun on these outdoors, but we had some cloudy weather and they didn't get as much sun as I wanted them to. So at this point, what you want to do is you want to transplant these and take them out of the seed tray. You want to be really delicate with these. For example, I like to push from the bottom and then also pull from the top very gently, because you don't want to disturb the roots or pull the stem too hard. Okay, so this is our root ball. The roots are nice and white and healthy. This looks really good. So now it's time to transplant, as I said, and there's a few things you want to keep in mind. We could just put this directly in the ground, and that would be fine. But 2 things. One is these roots are kind of tightly bound right now, because I've had them in this seed tray, which has walls, and any container that you put your seedling in is going to conform to the shape, more or less. Now, you could put this directly in the ground, but the problem is, since these roots are kind of growing into themselves, you're not going to get a lot of outward root growth. And that's what you want. You want the roots to be as free as possible to try to find as much nutrients in the soil as possible. If you leave them like this and the roots stay relatively confined, well, that means the plant's only going to get the nutrients that are confined to this space. So if you imagine if you had a root ball this big, it's going to have that much more space to gather all the nutrients it wants to grow. If you had a root ball that was just, half of this, just a little bit, it's only going to have, that much ability or that much space to absorb all the nutrients that it needs. So what we want to do is set this seedling up for success. And we're going to take these roots, and I'm just going to gently pull them a little bit. And in fact, you can rip the bottom part just off. So as you can see, there was that bottom rim, and I'm just going to take that part off. And this might seem a little bit shocking to do, because I just tore off the bottom of the roots. Okay, so I'm having some second thoughts after watching this, and although I always use this strategy of sort of just tearing off the roots from the bottom of the root ball, But after thinking about it and also doing some research, a better method of doing this is actually to take some scissors and just cut off the bottom. But if you look now, it's not confined anymore. We still have a little bit on the sides, and what I'm going to do with that is just basically just loosen this up and try to get these roots to be as loose as possible. And a lot of dirt's going to fall out while you're doing this. Just get them as loose as possible without doing too much in terms of disruption of them. So now this is much looser. The rule of thumb here is you don't want to take off more than about a third of the whole root ball. And I did much, much less than that. But as you can see here, we're nice and loose, and these things and these roots are actually going to have a better ability to grow outwards. Okay, so I'm not going to put these directly in the ground yet because I'm not ready for them. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to up pot them into a larger, this happens to be a larger seed starting container. So I'm going to put this aside for a second. I'm going to show you these cells are much, much bigger than in this green one. And so this is going to be the next stage of them to get, even larger. So they'll get about like this large in this container. And what I did is I put some soil at the bottom down here. I'm going to put the seedling in and then just backfill it. So I'm going to, again, take my seedling really gently. I'm going to put it in here. And that soil's already been wet. And actually, I'll just use some of the same soil that came out of this and just start backfilling. And try to get as much soil as you can in there so those roots can start to grow. Now this isn't packed too hard, but I'm going to add a little bit more just to make sure there's no big air bubbles in there. And that's it. This needs more water because the soil I put on is relatively dry. I'm just going to pack it down a little bit. And now this is ready to keep growing. And that's it. This soil I put in here is relatively dry. And all of these, as I said, had kind of wet soil to begin with. So I'm actually going to wait to water these. I think they have plenty of water. And in probably a couple days, I'm going to water the whole thing. Because the soil that I put in here originally, that was about half of each cell, I just wet that as well. So this soil is nice and wet. The cells themselves were pretty wet. And the soil I put around it is dry. Okay, and that's it. If you follow the steps I've showed you in this video, you're going to be set up for success. And by springtime, you're going to have a thriving garden. So if you have any questions or comments about this video, or you'd like to reach out to me with specific questions, feel free to leave comments below and I'll do my best to reply to them. Okay, good luck with your garden and thanks again for watching.